Why Rikers Island in New York is being shut down. The island sits in the shadow of the world's most famous city. Planes descend overhead every few minutes. Traffic moves. Lights glow. Life goes on. But here, behind layers of fencing and concrete, thousands once waited, not convicted, not sentenced, just held. And what happened inside these walls became so disturbing that the city made a rare promise: this place will be shut down. What led to that decision is more complicated and more unsettling than most people realize. Rikers Island is not a prison in the traditional sense. It was designed as a jail, a holding complex for people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. That difference matters. Because in theory, many of the people here were legally innocent. They hadn't been convicted of anything yet. They were waiting for their day in court. But over decades, the island developed a reputation that sounded more like a war zone than a detention center. Officers assaulted inmates. Inmates assaulted officers. Violence became routine. Medical neglect made headlines. And internal reports revealed a culture that had grown beyond the control of the system meant to manage it. To understand why Rikers is being shut down, you have to understand how it became what it is, and what daily life inside actually looked like. What happens next begins long before the jail doors close. The island itself was expanded using landfill and city waste throughout the early and mid-1900s. Garbage literally helped build the ground the jail stands on. By the 1930s, New York City needed a new detention complex. Overcrowding in Manhattan facilities was already a problem. Rikers Island seemed like a solution: isolated, expandable, and removed from public view. At first, officials described it as modern and efficient. A controlled environment. Structured. Orderly. But isolation cuts both ways. Distance makes oversight harder. Transparency weaker. And over time, internal culture becomes more powerful than external rules. By the 1970s and 80s, violence inside the complex was no longer rare. It was expected. Staff shortages, overcrowding, and poor training created a fragile balance of power. Informal inmate hierarchies formed. Protection networks developed. Survival strategies became necessary knowledge. Those who arrived without understanding the rules learned quickly, often the hard way. The first hours inside Rikers were designed to strip identity and establish control. Intake could take anywhere from several hours to more than a day, depending on backlog. New arrivals were searched, photographed, and processed through holding cells that were often packed beyond capacity. Noise never stopped. Metal doors. Shouting. Radios. Arguments. Sleep during intake was rare. Veterans of the system knew something important: the first impression you make inside can determine how the rest of your stay unfolds. Look too confident and you might be challenged. Look too afraid and you might be targeted. Neutrality became a survival skill. But intake was only the beginning. Assignment was what mattered. Where you were housed, and with whom, could define your safety. And what determined that placement was not always predictable. Housing units on Rikers varied widely. Some were dormitory-style rooms with dozens of beds. Others were cell blocks. Some units held people accused of minor offenses. Others housed individuals charged with serious violent crimes. Classification systems existed, but errors happened. When classification failed, consequences followed. Dorm units had their own internal structures. Informal leaders. Alliances. Conflicts. In some units, certain bunks were considered safer than others. Corners allowed visibility. Positions near officers' stations reduced risk. Those spots were not randomly assigned, they were negotiated or claimed. New arrivals watched carefully. Who spoke first? Who others listened to? Who was avoided? Power inside didn't always match charges on paper. Sometimes the most influential inmate was not the most physically intimidating, but the one with connections, resources, or information. And the officers assigned to each unit played a major role in how safe, or dangerous, the environment became. What many people don't realize is that two units on the same floor could feel like two different worlds. Officer culture inside Rikers developed its own reputation. Some officers were known for professionalism and restraint. Others were known for aggression. Internal investigations over the years documented patterns of excessive force, falsified reports, and group punishments. One of the most controversial practices involved what inmates described as blind spots, areas not fully covered by cameras where force incidents were more likely to occur. Officially, oversight increased over time. But trust between inmates and staff had already eroded. In tense units, small disputes escalated quickly. A delayed meal. A denied request. A misunderstanding during count. And when force was used, accountability did not always follow immediately. Internal reports later revealed that paperwork sometimes told a different story than injuries did. But violence between inmates was also a constant risk, and in some cases, more feared than officer force. Because inside, reputation spreads fast. And weakness spreads faster. Recreation time was supposed to reduce tension. Instead, it often exposed it. Yard periods brought together people with unresolved disputes. Arguments from housing units continued outside. Debts were settled. Alliances were tested. And officers had to monitor dozens of interactions at once. Some inmates chose not to attend yard at all, even though skipping recreation meant less movement, less air, less relief from confinement. Avoiding yard could be safer than attending. That choice alone says something about conditions. Daily routines inside followed a strict schedule. Wake-up counts. Meals. Medication lines. Legal visits. Lock-ins. Movement was controlled by gates and escort teams. Delays were common. So were sudden lockdowns. Lockdowns could last hours, sometimes days, depending on incidents elsewhere in the facility. During lockdown, everyone paid the price for the actions of a few. What happens psychologically during repeated lockdown cycles is something researchers later studied closely, and their findings raised serious concerns. Extended confinement changes behavior. Irritability increases. Sleep patterns break. Anxiety grows. Small frustrations become explosive. When people live under constant stress with limited autonomy, conflict becomes more likely, not less. This created a feedback loop inside Rikers. Tension led to incidents. Incidents led to restrictions. Restrictions increased tension. Breaking that cycle proved harder than administrators expected. But the most troubling revelations did not come from routine reports. They came from investigations. And what those investigations uncovered is part of why the shutdown decision became unavoidable. Independent oversight bodies began documenting patterns that could not be dismissed as isolated events. Injury rates were high. Use of force incidents exceeded national averages. Youth detainees, especially, faced elevated risk of assault. One widely cited investigation found that violence had become normalized in certain units. Staff intervention was inconsistent. In some cases, it was delayed intentionally to let situations resolve themselves. That phrase appeared more than once. But situations inside detention environments rarely resolve themselves peacefully. Especially when power structures are informal and accountability is unclear. Public attention grew after several high-profile cases exposed breakdowns in supervision and care. Lawsuits followed. Settlements followed. Policy reforms were announced. But internal culture changes slowly. And critics began asking a harder question. Not how to fix Rikers, but whether it could be fixed at all. What happened next shifted the conversation from reform to closure. The idea of shutting down Rikers Island once sounded unrealistic. The complex held thousands of detainees at any given time. It functioned as a central intake hub for the entire city. Closing it meant redesigning how pretrial detention worked. But pressure kept building. Oversight reports. Legal action. Public scrutiny. Budget analyses. Each added weight to the argument that incremental reform was not enough. The proposal that emerged was radical by correctional standards, replaced the island jail with smaller borough-based facilities closer to courts, families, and legal resources. Supporters argued this would reduce isolation and improve accountability. Opponents warned it could create new risks and new costs. The debate became political, logistical, and emotional. Because closing a jail is not just a construction decision. It is an admission of systemic failure. And the deeper reasons behind that failure go beyond violence alone. They involve staffing, mental health, pretrial detention policy, and something few people outside the system fully understand, the economics of holding people who have not yet been convicted. That part of the story changes how the entire system looks. The policy pressure that changed everything. The turning point in the shutdown decision wasn't just violence, it was policy failure stacking on top of operational failure. Over time, one fact kept surfacing in report after report. A large percentage of people held on the island had not been convicted of a crime. They were there because they couldn't afford bail, missed court dates, or were caught in slow legal processes. That changed how critics framed the problem. This wasn't just about how a jail was run. It was about who was being held there, and why. Pretrial detention was meant to ensure people appeared in court and protected public safety. But inside the system, delays were common. Court calendars were crowded. Legal representation varied in quality and availability. Some detainees stayed for months waiting for resolution on low-level charges. Time inside began to function like a sentence, before a sentence ever existed. And when someone is exposed to a high-risk environment without a conviction, oversight bodies start asking harder questions. What is the justification? What is the human cost? What is the long-term effect? Those questions began to reshape the debate around the island. Court backlogs created invisible pressure on jail capacity. When cases moved slowly, population stayed high. When population stayed high, housing units became crowded. When units became crowded, tensions rose. Administrators tried transfers, reassignments, and temporary expansions, but those were short-term fixes. The deeper issue was flow. People came in faster than they left. And when systems clog, stress travels downward, from administrators to officers, from officers to inmates, from inmates to each other. That stress is not abstract. It shows up in behavior. Tone. Reaction time. Decision-making. Inside Rikers, staff frequently worked overtime shifts. Fatigue became normal. Burnout became expected. New recruits entered a culture already stretched thin. And culture, once formed, resists change. What happens next in environments like this is rarely dramatic at first. It is gradual. Subtle. Then suddenly undeniable. Staffing shortages made supervision inconsistent. Some housing areas operated below recommended officer-to-inmate ratios. That changed how authority functioned on the floor. When fewer officers are present, informal inmate governance rises. Not officially. Not on paper. But in practice. Certain inmates begin organizing line order. Mediating disputes. Controlling access to shared resources. Deciding who gets which phone time slot. Who uses which shower first. Who sits where at meals. This shadow structure can reduce chaos, temporarily. But it also creates power centers the system does not officially recognize and cannot easily regulate. Administrators knew this pattern. Correctional research has documented it for decades. But reversing it requires staffing stability and consistent supervision, both of which were increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, another crisis was growing, one that could not be managed with more officers alone. The mental health burden inside the facility was rising sharply. A significant portion of detainees arriving at the island required mental health services. Some came with diagnosed conditions. Others arrived untreated and undiagnosed. The stress of confinement made symptoms worse. Sleep deprivation, uncertainty, and fear amplify underlying disorders. Providing mental health care in a detention environment is complex. Security protocols slow movement. Appointments are missed due to lockdowns. Medication schedules are disrupted by staffing gaps or transport delays. When treatment breaks down, behavior changes. Erratic behavior inside jail is often punished before it is treated. Infractions lead to restriction. Restriction worsens mental state. Worsened mental state leads to further infractions. A loop forms. Investigators later concluded that this cycle was one of the most destabilizing forces inside the complex, and one of the hardest to correct under existing conditions. And then came the cases that made the issue impossible to ignore. Several high-profile detainee cases drew public attention to conditions inside the facility. Lawsuits described excessive force incidents, delayed medical care, and unsafe housing placements. Families spoke publicly. Attorneys released documentation. Oversight boards issued urgent findings. These were not anonymous statistics anymore. They were individual stories with timelines, medical records, and incident reports. Public trust eroded further. City leadership faced a reality that correctional professionals understand well but rarely admit publicly. When a facility develops a deeply embedded culture problem, policy reform alone may not be enough. Training programs help. New rules help. New leadership helps. But culture, daily behavior norms, changes slowly unless the structure itself changes. That realization is what shifted the shutdown plan from symbolic to operational. But closing a complex like this is not simple. Where do the detainees go? Who supervises them? How is risk managed differently? Those answers required a complete redesign of detention strategy. The replacement plan proposed smaller, borough-based detention facilities located closer to courts. The theory was straightforward: shorter transport times, faster legal access, more family visitation, tighter oversight, and reduced isolation. Smaller facilities are easier to monitor. Problems surface faster. Accountability becomes more direct. But critics raised concerns. Would smaller jails truly reduce violence? Or simply redistribute it? Would staff culture transfer with personnel? Would construction delays extend reliance on the island longer than planned? Those questions remain part of the ongoing debate. Because announcing a closure is one thing. Executing it is another. And during the transition period, conditions inside the existing complex still have to be managed, safely. That creates a difficult paradox: how do you stabilize a facility you already plan to close? When a shutdown plan is announced, morale can shift in unpredictable ways. Some staff prepare to transfer. Some retire early. Some disengage. Recruiting new officers becomes harder when the workplace has a closing date attached to it. Operational strain can increase during the very period when stability is most needed. Administrators must balance reform with continuity, and that balance is delicate. Inside housing units, detainees also react to uncertainty. Rumors spread. Timelines become distorted. Expectations rise and fall based on incomplete information. Uncertainty is a stress multiplier. And stress inside confinement environments often shows itself through conflict. Which brings us to something rarely discussed publicly: the unwritten survival rules detainees follow day by day. Because official rules are only half the rulebook. What happens next depends on the other half. Survival inside the complex depended on awareness and restraint. Knowing when to speak and when not to. Understanding personal space boundaries. Avoiding involvement in disputes that don't directly concern you. Respecting shared equipment. Never interfering with line order. Small violations of these norms could trigger outsized reactions. Trust was built slowly, and lost instantly. Information moved fast. Reputation moved faster. A single confrontation could echo through multiple units within hours through word of mouth alone. Those who navigated successfully often described the same strategy: stay predictable, stay respectful, stay observant. But predictability doesn't guarantee safety in volatile environments. And that is one of the clearest indicators that a system is under strain. Because safety should not depend on social navigation skills alone. It should depend on structure. The final piece of this story, and the one that ultimately pushed the shutdown plan forward, involves oversight intervention at the highest level and the legal mechanisms used to force change when internal reform stalled. That stage changed the timeline, and raised the stakes, in ways few expected. Federal oversight and the moment control slipped away. When internal reform struggles to take hold, the next level of intervention comes from outside. In this case, that meant federal oversight. Not advisory. Not symbolic. Enforceable. Investigators didn't just review policies. They reviewed patterns. Incident frequency. Response times. Injury reports. Video evidence. Training records. Disciplinary follow-up. What they found suggested that the problem wasn't one policy failure or one leadership gap. It was systemic drift, the slow normalization of unsafe practice. Facilities rarely collapse all at once. They degrade gradually. Standards bend. Exceptions multiply. Shortcuts become routine. Eventually, what was once unacceptable becomes ordinary. Oversight reports described environments where force incidents were too frequent, supervision too inconsistent, and accountability too slow. Recommendations were issued. Deadlines were established. Compliance benchmarks were set. And then something important happened. Deadlines began to pass without full compliance. That changed the legal posture entirely. Once mandated reforms fall behind schedule, oversight bodies gain leverage. Court involvement becomes more likely. External monitors receive expanded authority. Reporting becomes more detailed and more frequent. Inside the jail system, that creates operational pressure. Every incident now carries legal weight. Every delay becomes documented risk. Administrative meetings multiply. Training sessions intensify. Paperwork expands. But paperwork cannot change culture by itself. Officers still walk the tiers. Inmates still live the routines. Tension still rises and falls hour by hour. And when frontline reality doesn't match reform language, credibility erodes, inside and outside the walls. Officials faced a narrowing set of options: accelerate reform dramatically, restructure operations, or move faster toward closure. What happens when an institution reaches that crossroads is rarely orderly. Shift changes inside detention facilities are sensitive moments. Responsibility transfers. Information is handed off. Unit mood can change depending on who takes post. Veteran officers often know which tensions are building and which personalities are clashing. That knowledge is valuable, but it isn't always captured in formal logs. During reform pressure periods, staffing patterns become less stable. Transfers increase. Retirements rise. New officers arrive with limited on-floor experience. Informal knowledge chains weaken. In volatile units, that matters. Because anticipation prevents incidents more often than reaction stops them. Supervisors began reporting a difficult reality. Even when new rules were clear, consistent enforcement varied by shift, by team, by experience level. That inconsistency made expectations unclear, and unclear expectations invite testing. Testing leads to confrontation. Confrontation leads to force. Force leads to investigation. The cycle repeated. And above it all, the clock toward shutdown kept ticking. The hidden logistics of closing a mega jail. Closing a detention complex the size of this one is not like locking a building and walking away. It is more like dismantling a small city, one that runs 24 hours a day under legal mandate. Every detainee must be reassessed. Security classification reviewed. Court proximity considered. Medical needs mapped. Mental health services reassigned. Transportation routes redesigned. Staffing rosters rebuilt. Union agreements renegotiated. Court scheduling synchronized. Even meal contracts must be rewritten. Movement plans alone require thousands of coordinated decisions. Who moves first? Which units transfer together? How rival groups are separated? How medical continuity is maintained? How legal access is preserved during relocation? One miscalculation can trigger conflict. Administrators describe the process as operational chess, except every piece is human and every move carries risk. And while planners worked on the future system, the present one still had to function safely each day. That dual burden strained leadership bandwidth. Transportation is one of the most vulnerable phases in detention operations. Movement creates exposure. Exposure creates opportunity for conflict or escape attempts. That's why transfers are tightly controlled. Timed, escorted, documented. Under a closure plan, transfers increase sharply. More transfers mean more coordination. More coordination means more points of possible failure. Weather delays. Court delays. Staffing gaps. Mechanical problems. Any disruption can ripple across schedules. Inside holding areas, delays feel longer than they are. Frustration grows faster than administrators expect. Officers must manage uncertainty minute by minute. And uncertainty, again, is a stress multiplier. Which leads to a critical question officials had to confront directly. If the environment is already strained, how do you prevent deterioration during transition? The answer turned out to be uncomfortable. You can't rely on rules alone. You must reshape incentives. Changing incentives inside the walls. Late-stage reform efforts focused heavily on behavior incentives, for both staff and detainees. De-escalation training expanded. Supervisory review tightened. Incident reporting became more transparent. Body-worn camera programs were tested in certain areas. Early warning systems flagged repeated force involvement. The goal was simple in theory: reward restraint, detect escalation early, intervene faster. But incentives only work when participants believe the system applying them is consistent and fair. Some officers welcomed the changes. Others viewed them as second-guessing split-second decisions. That tension showed up in internal surveys and union statements. Meanwhile, detainee incentive programs attempted to reduce unit conflict through privilege structures, additional phone access, expanded recreation eligibility, program participation credits. Results were mixed. In lower-tension units, behavior improved. In high-tension units, informal power structures sometimes overrode formal incentives. Which reveals a deeper truth about confined environments. Official authority and social authority are not always the same thing. And when they diverge, order becomes fragile. What administrators feared most during the shutdown runway was not one major incident, but many small ones accumulating faster than reform could keep pace. The human side most reports only briefly mention. Behind every policy debate were individual lives moving through the system day by day. Some detainees were held briefly. Others stayed months. Some maintained steady legal support. Others struggled to reach counsel. Family visitation required travel, scheduling, clearance, and patience. Distance from family increases emotional strain. Emotional strain affects behavior. Behavior affects safety. That chain appears again and again in correctional research. Officers experienced human strain too. Long shifts. Public criticism. Operational danger. Split-second decisions judged later in slow motion. Many reported feeling caught between reform mandates and on-floor realities. Two human pressures facing each other across bars and uniforms. Neither fully seen by the public. And as the shutdown plan advanced, both groups faced the same uncertainty: what happens to us next? Because closures change careers as well as custody. The deadline problem. Closure plans depend on replacement capacity being ready on time. Construction projects depend on permits, funding flows, contractor performance, inspections, and weather. Delays are common. In detention planning, delays are dangerous. If new facilities open late, the old one must operate longer than planned. Operating longer means extended strain. Extended strain increases incident risk. Increased risk invites further oversight intervention. Officials built contingency timelines. Then built contingency plans for those timelines. Redundancy became necessary. But contingency planning carries its own message inside institutions: uncertainty remains. And uncertainty changes behavior. Which brings us to the final and most difficult question, the one policymakers rarely state plainly. If a jail must close because it cannot operate safely, what does that say about the system that created it? The answer is not simple. It touches bail policy, court speed, mental health infrastructure, staffing models, and political will. It suggests that facilities fail not only because of what happens inside them, but because of pressures placed on them from outside. And that realization is what makes this story larger than one island. The buildings will eventually go quiet. The gates will close. The transfer buses will stop running. But the lessons about oversight, culture, incentives, and human pressure under confinement remain active long after the lights turn off. Because when a system reaches the point where closure becomes the safest option, the real story is not just about the place. It's about everything that allowed the place to become what it was. The island will eventually fall silent. The gates will lock for the last time. But silence doesn't erase what happened here. It only forces us to decide whether we learn from it. Rikers Island wasn't shut down because it was old. It wasn't shut down because it was expensive. It was shut down because a system meant to hold people temporarily became something far more dangerous than it was ever designed to be. And as this chapter closes, the question that lingers isn't what replaced it, but whether the same failures are already taking shape somewhere else.